Since assuming power, Captain Ibrahim Traore has been diversifying Burkina Faso's relationships with other countries. This has now offered phenomenal gain to not only his country, but the whole of Africa in general. If you can remember, whenever the Western countries offered any help to African countries, they called it aid. Charity they offered Africans to show their generosity. They would publicize it to everyone to make themselves look like the biggest helpers. Since African countries depended on food and money, they had to swallow the bitter pill in thanking for help. Until then, African countries did not know how it is to establish relations with non-Western countries. It did not have real allies and friends that could help it in times of need without bragging. But as Captain Ibrahim Traore has established deep relations with Russia, more African countries are diversifying their allies. To prove Russia's loyalty, Putin promised to offer free grain to 6 African countries. Note that it was not called aid or charity, but only free grain. It was a big promise, and the West criticized that it could never be kept. Now, with the shipment of grain to African countries, people in the West have been silenced on what will happen next. But why has Putin offered free grain? And what's the robust relationship developing between Russia and African countries? Let's know about that in this video. This year, we saw a phenomenal Russia-Africa summit in St. Petersburg, with the participation of 49 out of 55 African nations, a notable increase from the 43 nations present at the 2019 event. Despite facing criticism in Western media, the actual outcomes paint a different picture than what the Western media has portrayed. Key agreements were reached, including the decision to hold future summits every 3 years and establish an annual Russia-Africa Parliamentary Forum. Regular political consultations between Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and the chairman of the African Union were initiated. Russia announced plans to expand its diplomatic presence in Africa by opening new embassies and consulates, alongside establishing Russian media bureaus, including TASS, RT, newspapers, and radio programs. Discussions were also focused on exploring the potential for providing African nations with visa-free access to Russia under specific categories. Russia and participating African countries committed to contributing to a more just, balanced, and stable multipolar world order, opposing any form of international confrontation in Africa. It is something we have never seen before, a consensus between African countries and Russia to take ties on another level. Even if African countries used to engage with Russia in the past, those instances were never carefully chosen. But now, African countries are the decision makers, and that's why they have chosen to kick out former colonial powers and get closer to countries they feel are important. This stance directly opposes the Western model of a unipolar global regime led by the United States, indicating a shift within the African part of the global South away from the European Union. Russia pledged support for Africa to have a voice on the United Nations Security Council and proposed full membership of the African Union as part of the G20. Regarding food security, Russia outlined plans to increase exports of food, fertilizers, vehicles, and industrial machinery to Africa, with transactions settled increasingly in national currencies, including the ruble. Moscow intended to send commercial and humanitarian grain shipments to several African nations to provide sustainable and affordable deliveries. Even if the free grain was quite an important incentive, it was not alone. Addressing debt issues, Russia wrote off $23 billion of African debt and discussed allocating an additional $90 million to reduce the overall debt burden of African countries. In the energy sector, Russia committed to assisting in developing Africa's energy industry, extending beyond traditional sources like oil and gas to include green energy and power plants, including nuclear facilities. Rosatom, the Russian nuclear energy corporation, will play a significant role in these developments, with countries like Burundi, Egypt, Rwanda, South Africa, Tanzania, and Zimbabwe considered ready for nuclear power. The World Health Organization participated in the summit, where Russia announced its commitment to investing 1.2 billion rubles in substantial support for healthcare systems throughout Africa. What's more, considerable attention was directed towards the formal inclusion of several East African countries in the International North-South Transportation Corridor called ENSTC. This corridor facilitates multimodal logistics and transport between the Caspian Sea and the Persian Gulf, establishing a connection between Russia and the Middle East. The proposal to extend this corridor to Africa, with Egypt as a primary destination, aims to streamline Russia-Africa trade, offering a more efficient alternative to the longer and costlier Suez Canal route. Additionally, this extension would provide African nations, particularly those with Muslim populations, access to Central Asian markets. There was mutual agreement to enhance further trade, economic, and investment cooperation between Russia and African states. This collaboration extends to working with the African Union and prominent regional organizations such as the Arab Maghreb Union, the Southern African Development Community, and the Intergovernmental Authority on Development. This suggests the potential for discussions on free trade agreements with the Eurasian Economic Union, especially with the SADC. Russia explicitly recognized the operations of the African Continental Free Trade Area, acknowledging its benefits for Pan-African sourcing and manufacturing. Russia and the 49 participating African nations reached an agreement on the 2023 Russia-Africa Summit Declaration, addressing various issues and outlining future intentions. Despite being publicly dismissed in the West, the Russia-Africa Summit significantly bolstered relations, prompting concerns. It was an explicit announcement that African countries and Russia have forged a new alliance that has the capacity to subtract the West from the world stage. But currently, before African countries can engage in global affairs, they have to be internally strong. This requires strong leadership that has plans to ensure food and territorial security. Putin has blamed the West for failing to deliver grain to the world's poorest nations, assuring African countries that Russia could replace Ukrainian grain free of charge due to an anticipated record harvest this year. Alex Vines, head of the African program at Chatham House, observed that Moscow has long sought to establish an alternative financial and commercial system independent of the West, a goal heightened by the sanctions imposed on Russia following its invasion of Ukraine last year. Consequently, Africa is crucial to Russia as it seeks new partnerships. It's worth noting that Lavrov has undertaken 8 trips to Africa since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February last year. The West does not know how deep the ties have become. However, the Western media has engaged in full-scale propaganda in an effort to make African countries disillusioned about Russia. But Africa can see and judge things by itself this time. Africa's 54 nations collectively form the largest voting bloc at the United Nations. Their stance on General Assembly resolutions critical of Russia's invasion has been more divided than any other region. Analyst Cameron Hudson with the US-based Center for Strategic and International Studies suggests that if African nations had left the summit feeling unheard, they would have distanced themselves from Russia, marking a decisive moment in their relationship with Putin. But this did not happen. Rather, all the African heads of state conveyed their satisfaction, especially due to Putin's personal interests in helping Africa and becoming an important ally. Seeing this with a practical and rational approach, the close relations between Russia and Africa are a win-win. Russia can not only offer instant help to African countries to get out of the urgent crises, but also help Africa develop its own industries permanently. Since the former colonial powers left Africa, the continent remained dependent on other countries for finished products. But we all know how capable Russia is in manufacturing, and it can teach African countries to achieve full self-sufficiency. Before Russia can help Africa in industrialization, it must first help Africa in urgent crises like food security. That's why Putin assured that Russia would provide free grain to low-income African countries following the termination of the grain deal. After this, Russia can get closer to Africa, forming an alliance the world has never seen before. Russia could establish connections with African nations in ways that the West couldn't, according to Tim Kalyagira, a Ugandan analyst and writer. It's because Russia and African countries have a history together, and their culture, even if they are different, represent the same principle: preserving what's sacred instead of changing it after the West's change of moral standards. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. You should know that the US hosted its Africa Summit last year, part of a series of such gatherings by global powers, including China, France, Turkey, Japan, and Britain. It was worth asking why Americans should care about competing in Africa or investing in its stability. The answer was clear. Africa was poised to shape the 21st century as the world's fastest-growing demographic and economic power. It becomes clear that the US and Europe are trying harder than ever before to engage and win Africa. But this won't happen as African countries now know that Russia and China are better options. On the one hand, Russia can help Africa with security, while China can offer phenomenal economic benefits. One thing should be clear. African states would no doubt rather be kingmakers than be caught in another proxy war. A smart approach will be to straddle these powers for maximum benefit. In other words, instead of leaving the West for Russia and China or vice versa, the African countries should establish relations with all of them for maximum advantages. But no matter what, Putin's promises that were not being believed are now a reality. Russia began free shipments of grain recently, totaling up to 200,000 tons, to 6 African countries as promised by President Vladimir Putin. The shipments, including Burkina Faso, Somalia, Eritrea, Zimbabwe, Mali, and the Central African Republic, came after Moscow withdrew from a UN-brokered Black Sea grain deal with Ukraine. Putin emphasized the Soviet Union's historical support for African liberation movements and newly independent African states, highlighting Russia's long-standing ties to Africa. For Putin, offering free grains is only a small token of help that Russia can provide to Africa. But you should know that Russia wants to teach Africa how to fish, besides giving it fish, if things are explained in the context of a Chinese proverb. Russia knows that Africa currently needs immediate grains, so there is no time to first help African countries develop their agriculture and grow their own crops. Therefore, first offering grains and then helping Africa in agriculture and industrialization is the right strategy, which African countries know. But Russia is not alone in the new African ties. China currently holds the position of Africa's largest trade partner, pledging $60 billion in funding to African countries in 2018. In contrast, Russia, at the 2019 summit, claimed deals worth $12.5 billion, primarily in the form of non-binding memorandums of understanding. Some agreements reinforced existing arms deals, underscoring Russia's appeal to authoritarian leaders like Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni and Zimbabwe's President Emerson Mnangagwa. African experts say that the summit presents Russia with an opportunity to strengthen ties with African nations. But African leaders must exercise caution regarding endorsements of problematic actions and deals. These agreements underscore the challenging and uneven trade dynamics between Africa and Russia, where Russia provides weaponry but contributes little to the everyday lives of people on the continent, be it in terms of goods or job opportunities through investments. However, at this specific moment, Russia cannot exploit African countries. It's because, unlike European countries who used to exploit and send precious resources back home from Africa, Russia will invest in Africa. Russian businesses show a keen interest in investing in African countries as a strategic response to the challenges posed by international sanctions and the potential freezing of their assets and operations. Therefore, investing in Africa is a win-win for both parties. You should know that Russia has faced a series of international sanctions imposed by Western countries and alliances, primarily in response to actions like the annexation of Crimea and the conflict in Ukraine. These sanctions specifically target Russian banks, businesses, and individuals associated with the government. The repercussions of these sanctions have been substantial for the Russian economy, leading to constraints on accessing global financial markets and disrupting the regular operations of Russian businesses engaged in international trade. Given these challenges, Russian businesses are actively exploring alternative markets and investment opportunities beyond the jurisdictions affected by sanctions. Africa, with its growing economies and emerging markets, stands out as an appealing option for diversification. According to the UN, Africa is the most profitable region in the world. Investing in African countries offers Russian businesses a strategic avenue to protect their assets from potential freezing or seizure under international sanctions. By establishing a presence in regions less directly impacted by these sanctions, they seek to safeguard their investments and ensure uninterrupted operations. African nations may provide opportunities for strategic alliances and economic partnerships that are less influenced by the geopolitical tensions leading to sanctions against Russia. Cultivating robust economic ties in Africa could offer Russian businesses increased stability and resilience against the effects of global sanctions. In all that, African countries can develop their industries instead of allowing them to repeat what Europe did until now. Africa's abundant natural resources make it an attractive prospect for Russian companies, especially those in the energy and mining sectors. Russian business can, therefore, help African countries establish their mining companies and benefit from their resources. Russian President Vladimir Putin announced that his nation and the African leaders attending a summit in St. Petersburg agreed to promote a multipolar world order and combat neo-colonialism. Putin delivered these remarks at the conclusion of the two-day summit, seen as a test of Moscow's backing in Africa amid international isolation resulting from its war in Ukraine. During the summit, Putin emphasized the joint determination to counter neo-colonialism, the practice of applying illegitimate sanctions, and attempts to undermine traditional moral values. Representatives from 49 countries, including 17 heads of state, participated and signed a joint declaration advocating for a more just, balanced, and stable multipolar world order, opposing various forms of international confrontation on the African continent. Now, it appears that both Russia and African countries are on the same page on creating a multipolar world. For years, the African continent has been kept out of global matters. But now, as a new world order is being shaped, African countries can take center stage. In recent years, a noticeable new scramble for Africa has unfolded, with major powers like Russia and China, along with regional players like the United Arab Emirates, making significant diplomatic and economic advances into the continent. This trend, labeled as a new scramble, suggests that these powers are displacing the influence of traditional colonial powers such as Britain and France. For example, in predominantly Francophone West Africa, France, which dominated 9 out of 16 countries in 1980, now exerts influence in only 3, according to the formal Bilateral Influence Capacity Index. However, the narrative of the new scramble overlooks the fact that Russia's presence in Africa is not a recent development. Countries like Ghana, Guinea, and Mali recall the Soviet Union, led by Russia, as a powerful anti-colonial force striving to liberate Africans from European and American oppression. Russia's involvement in Africa has been enduring, featuring economic and military support for socialist-leaning governments and militias during liberation wars. Throughout the years, Russia has maintained a continuous diplomatic presence in most African nations. Recent times have witnessed a surge in Russian arms transfers to Africa, constituting 40% of arms imported by African countries since 2018. Additionally, the state-sponsored Wagner mercenary group has become deeply entwined in countries like the Central African Republic and Sudan, providing not just military training but also security for resource-rich areas in exchange for a share of profits. While China outpaces Russia in overall trade with Africa, Russia wields significant influence, particularly in the crucial agricultural sector. Disinformation campaigns, including anti-colonialist narratives, have further enhanced Russian influence, evident in actions on the streets of Chad, Mali, and other nations. These efforts have translated into diplomatic support at the UN, where several African nations have either opposed or abstained from condemning Russia's actions in Ukraine. Last year, Burkina Faso witnessed protesters waving Russian flags after a coup, and now it's Niger. To prevent this pattern from repeating, US and European leaders are trying hard, but this is not working. It appears that the China-Russia combo has worked in Africa in replacing the European powers. Interestingly, for the West, maintaining the status quo will lead to Africa aligning more closely with Russia and its no-limits friendship with China than with the West. Now, as Putin has kept his promise of offering free grain to African countries, analysts are expecting surprising agreements between the two parties. Earlier, African countries were engaging with Russia carefully to test whether they could rely on it or not. Now, after years of engagement and the first Russia-Africa summit, things have become quite clear. It's expected that soon, Russia will do military and security deals with Africa to ensure African countries maintain their territorial integrity. Even if the West has been criticizing Russia for not investing in Africa, we will see hundreds of billions of dollars being injected into Africa by Russia, besides China. What do you think? Can Russia be a more reliable ally for African countries than Europe and the US? Should Captain Ibrahim Traore and other African leaders trust Putin and get closer to establishing deeper ties? Let us know your thoughts on what the West will do, as Russia and Africa are forming a lethal combination. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.